Welcome back to bring you an inside look at what's happening at the state capitol this week. We have our On Politics panel here this morning. Senator Wendy Davis is a Democrat from Fort Worth. She is the vice chair of the new Senate Select Committee on Open Government. Greg Holloway leads the Austin Tea Party Patriots. That's a conservative, fiscally focused movement separate from the Republican Party. Dick Levine is the senior fiscal analyst for the Center for Public Policy Priorities, where he focuses on state tax and revenue issues. And Peggy Venable is director of the Texas Office of Americans for Prosperity and has worked in the political arena for 30 years. Welcome to you all. Senator Davis, let me begin with you. The TEA says that state funding for education has increased 63% per pupil since 2005, twice the rate of inflation, but student performance still lagging here in Texas. Why is more money at education a priority for you? Given that statistic.
You know, we have the second highest growing student population in the country, and though we have increased our spending at the state level and at the local level for public education, we still rank 44th in the country when you combine our state and local funding per pupil in the state of Texas. Ranking 44th, of course, isn't something to be tremendously proud of if we're seeing simultaneously that we're not attaining the kind of educational achievements that we'd like to see. In the state of Texas, we have one of the highest dropout rates in the country. I think we rank 44th on that as well. We have one of the lowest SAT score performances in the country, and we have the most number of adults who live in our state who don't have a high school education. That tells us something's broken and we need to fix it.
Greg, the senator's making an argument, more money for education.
Well, unfortunately, I just don't think we have more money for education this session. We certainly think that Texas needs to have a great public education system. We think that is a proper role of government. I think we're going to have to see very large cuts in education funding this particular session. We're very much in favor of having good education. As a matter of fact, I've got a group that has said that they would fund the initial startup of a nonprofit so that Texas families could contribute, and all of the money from the nonprofit would go directly into public education. So we're trying to find ways to bridge that gap. But if the funding is going to be an issue this particular year.
Dick, this is the year Texas is out of money.
Well, you know, you mentioned that starting in 2005, the states put so much more money into public education, but a lot of that was just to replace the property taxes that were lost to the school districts because the legislature made them all cut their rates by 1/3. And that created what we're now calling the structural deficit. The school districts gave up more than $14 billion in property taxes. The state said it would replace that money, and they raised the cigarette tax and created this new margins tax. But those new taxes left a hole of $10 billion in the budget. And it's called the structural deficit because that's $10 billion in every budget from now on until we change the structure of school finance. So that's a illusory increase in state funding. It's just a replacement for local funding, and it's a replacement the state can't really afford because they did it wrong in 2006.
Peggy, you're kind of shaking your head over there.
I have to say I don't agree. I think we've increased education spending. We've not gotten increased outcomes, but the problem is we're spending our education dollars largely outside the classroom. Only 50 cents out of each education dollar is actually spent on instruction. So when school districts are screaming that they're having to cut classes, to close down schools, and to eliminate teaching positions, they're really making cuts on things that are priorities to citizens. They're not cutting administration and outside the classroom. And frankly, we have lists and lists of things that school districts are spending their money on that, frankly, I think most taxpayers would be outraged at. For instance, in one school district in the Houston area, $25,000 at the Billery Factory, $7,000 Disneyland Resort, $4,000 to Backyard Grill, $78,000 to Westin Galleria. The list goes on and on. The key is we can cut education spending without cutting instruction.
Senator?
Well, I think it's always good for us to be forced to look at the way we're spending money in the state of Texas. And I guess the positive thing about a difficult budget climate is it's forcing the very kind of examination that Peggy talked about. And I look forward to the information that her group will give to us in that regard. But very thoughtful and very intelligent people across the state of Texas who are working toward how they're going to respond to this fiscal crisis are having a hard time making up that gap through the kinds of cuts that Peggy's talking about. And in fact, it is, even though they are looking first and foremost at their administrative expenses, they are still having to come into the classroom. They're having to cut teachers. Classroom sizes are growing, and we are threatened as a state, unfortunately, with a future that doesn't look very bright as a consequence of that. We right now have one of the highest expenditures on social needs in the state of Texas, and when we undereducate our population, we're going to wind up with a workforce that really isn't going to be able to sustain us over time, and the pressure on our social programs is going to grow much greater.
Greg, what about that point?
I think that's a great point, and I think actually Dick would agree with me in that we do have a big structural problem in this state. Here's the structural problem. We have public education that we want to fund. We have health and human services that the federal government says we must fund. Morally, I say we must fund it as well. I want more money for public services, for children's health, for nursing care. It would be unacceptable to cut the budget if we're going to put people who use the government as the provider of last resort out on the street. Not for that. But what we need to do is we need to move health and human services into more of the private sector, into the nonprofit. It's not sustainable like it is, and that's why we're very much in favor of cutting the budget now. The next session is going to be a disaster on health and human services if we don't cut the budget now.
Dick, didn't Texas voters in November shout, cut the spending, we've got to, and of course, no more taxes?
Well, it's not clear what the voters said. Every poll that's been taken since the election, when they ask what to cut, voters don't want to cut the investments in public education and higher education. They don't want to put people out on the street, people who are relying on the state for health and human services. And they don't want to cut back on prisons and roads and parks and all the other things the state does. So people are not facing the consequence. If you want something, sometimes you have to pay for it. If you want to make investments in the future that are going to pay back 5 and 10 times every dollar you put in, like pre-K, sometimes you have to put up the money now first.
This morning, our On Politics poll is asking the question, without a state budget set, are districts moving too quickly with teacher cuts? We'll find out what you have to say coming up. Plus, our On Politics panel fields your online chat this morning. Stay with us. More of Session 11 after this.